and welcome to a brand new project for Patreon. I'm so excited to bring you this project because for years I've wanted to do a pattern based on the Hawaiian tea timer set, which is a two-piece set with a top that's usually kind of long with frog closures and a band collar, and then a little capri pant that goes with it. So this is the Charm Patterns take on a tea timer, and we have introduced some comfort elements to it, like the elastic waist pant. So this is great for lounging as well as a cocktail hour, perhaps. And we've also given you our famous cup sizes. So as usual, you're going to have your A through H cup sizes. Specific to this pattern, we did do the groupings, the 3 groups of cup sizes. We tend to do that when things have a little bit of an easier fit, like the Hepburn top or the Harlow pajama. So you're gonna have your cup sizes in groups A to C, D through F, and then G and H. So 3 groups together. This is an entirely new pattern, so it only has 5 pattern pieces, which is great. So you're gonna need to download all of these pieces. It's not an expansion, so get those ready to go. You can make it in any of the fabrics that we recommended for the Harlow pajama. You can kind of transfer to this pattern. Rayons are great for this, anything drapey. Batik would be beautiful, cotton lawn. There are a lot of different things that you can do. Silks would be gorgeous, but anything with a little bit of drape to it. Now, the other thing I want to tell you is that you can mix and match these pieces with the Harlow pajama. So while it is a standalone pattern on its own, this top would look great with the Harlow pants, for instance, if you want an easier fit pant. And likewise, you could take the Harlow top and mix and match it with these little capris. So I like that versatility of it as well. And also I'll say that with the pant, there are a lot of similarities in the sewing between the tea timer and the Harlow. So if you feel like you need a little help familiarizing yourself with that style of pant, definitely check out my YouTube video on the Harlow pajama. So today, I'm not going to take you through every single step, but I am going to show you the steps that I think are the most crucial for you to understand. So we'll start by talking about supplies, and then we'll get sewing some of those more intense, or as I usually say, not as intuitive steps where you want me to hold your hand a little bit, okay? So let's get started talking about supplies. First of all, you want your pattern, of course. So as I mentioned, there are only 5 pattern pieces for this, which I love, makes it nice and simple. You have your collar, your top front, top back, your pant front, and your pant back. Okay, so you're gonna get those pieces cut out to your size. And then in terms of other supplies, obviously you'll need your fabric, so do consult the cutting layouts in the instructions. I'm gonna make mine with a different fabric for the top than for the pant, because I really like having the contrast between the two. It definitely gives you a little more dramatic oomph when your sides of your top open up and you can see the pant a different color. But that's just me. You could do them both in the same fabric too. Okay, so on that note, you will also want interfacing. So you need interfacing for the collar, and then also you're going to need 2 long strips of interfacing at the center front, on either side of center front of the top, to stabilize that overlap opening there. So the interfacing I use is from a place called Fashion Sewing Supply, and I really like their Pro Sheer Medium interfacing. It's a fusible interfacing, and it's really great for drapey fabrics like rayon, which I'm using today. So I will link you to all of these things, by the way, in the instructions. You're also going to want frog closures. So these aren't as hard to find as I thought that they would be. I got all 4 of these different frogs from Amazon, and they were all Amazon Prime too, by the way. So pretty easy to find in white and black. If you wanted a special color, you might have to do some more digging, like on Etsy or something like that. So I got these nice giant black ones. These ones are more delicate, the little white ones. It doesn't really matter what size you do. Just keep in mind if you go smaller, you may want more because you may want to fill in a little more space on the front. So what I recommend is that you have 4 for the top, but if they're smaller, just, maybe order a couple extra. You can also use these as accents on the pants, on the little side slits. So keep that in mind too if you want to order 2 extra to do on your pants. Would be really cute. Okay, so your frogs and then elastic for the pant waist. You're going to get an inch wide elastic and then just enough to go around your waist snugly. So, a yard or so should be good. And I really like this non-roll elastic. It has these sort of ribs vertically and it keeps it from rolling over when you wear it, which is great. So you're going to need that. And then just your usual sewing supplies. For the darts we're going to be sewing today, you definitely want some sort of carbon marking system. I really like this wax-coated tracing paper and a tracing wheel. Just find a color that's going to show up well on your fabric. And then you might also want your disappearing ink pen, and then just usual supplies, are all a given with this project. You guys know I love these 2x18 rulers, and then of course my Kai scissors. So those are your supplies. So I'm going to get started talking about first steps on the blouse. So I have already done my serging around my edges. I've pretty much done everything except for the curved edge of the neckline right there. And then on the pant, I did everything except for the crotch curve on the front and the back and the upper waist. So I'll give you guidelines for that in the instructions. I have also done stay stitching around the neckline. So at 1/2 inch, you're going to go from the shoulder to center front, using that 1/2 inch seam allowance to stabilize the neckline. Do that on the back as well. You are going to do strips of interfacing that are 2 inches wide along each side of center front like this. So that's going to give you a little stability. This is a cut-on facing, just so you know. So sometimes patterns have separate facing pieces. It's nice when you can eliminate the need for a seam by making the facing cut on like this, so it just folds in rather than having to be seamed here. All right, the other sort of unusual thing you may notice about this pattern is the shape of the darts. So you may have encountered a dart like this before, but if you haven't, it's called a fish eye dart, like the eye of a fish. I'm not sure why. And it is unusual because it's double-ended, right? So normally a dart would just look like either side of this and just be a wedge like that. This kind of dart you will see in garments without a waistline seam that needs some shaping. So if you think about it, there would normally be a waistline seam like right here, and then if this were the pant, there would be a dart going this way, and then on the top, the waist dart would be going that way. So it's basically eliminating the seam and then making 2 darts into one, so it's pretty cool. I'm going to show you how to pin and sew this dart. It's a little unusual, but nothing that you can't handle. So let's get started with this. You're going to fold this in half using the 2 ends as a guideline right there. So you're going to fold it in half like this. Now the way I sew my fish eye darts is that I start in the middle. I sew it in 2 steps, always starting in the middle. So I'll start in the middle and then go that way, tie off my ends, and then I'll turn it over so that I'm on this side, meet my stitching on the other side, sew to the end, tie off the dart, okay? Because as you know, if you watch my videos, I don't like to start at the point of a dart. So doing it in this 2-step process will eliminate the need to end at the point of the dart. Okay, so what you're going to do is I will always put pins vertically like that at each end. And then I'm going to pin this side first. Now this is a good example of, I always tell my students, you want to think about which way you're going to be putting this into your sewing machine, right? And that will help you decide which side of the fabric should be up. I'm going to put it into the sewing machine this way because you always want the bulk of your work to the left of your presser foot, right? So I want the pins to be on this side, but that's going to change when I go to the other side of the dart. So I'm going to pin along this line. And you can see why the marking is so important with these darts. And you're really going to have to transfer it from the pattern to your fabric accurately. I also went over mine with that purple disappearing ink just so you guys can see it a little bit better. Okay, so I pinned one side, and now I'm going to sew the other side from this direction, right? So I need my pins to be on this side of the fabric. It's always really annoying when you get to your machine and you realize that you pinned your darts the wrong way on the wrong side of the fabric. So when you put your pin through, make sure to check the other side of the fabric and make sure that the lines of the dart are aligned, and if they're not, just keep rolling the fabric between your fingers like I just did to get it to match. And there you go. We're going to go over to the machine. I'm going to sew one side, tie off the end, and then go to the other side, tie off the other end of the dart. So let's get sewing. Okay, let's sew these fisheye darts. So like I said, I'm going to start in the middle, and then I'm going to sew to one point first. So start right in the middle here. Make sure you're right on your line that you marked. And backstitch, all right? Don't forget that. You're going to backstitch when you start on both sides. Now, I am stitching along the line, taking my pins out as I go, stitching right along that marked line. And what's important here is that when you get close to the point, you're going to very, very gradually as you can, veer off the fabric, okay? You don't want to make a sudden move off the fabric, and you want your last couple stitches to be exactly parallel to that fold, and then you come off. You can even use your hand wheel like I just did. All right, so instead of back stitching here, I'm going to leave some nice long tails, about 5 inches there, and then I'm going to tie a knot. On that side and trim it close. Okay, now I'm going to turn the whole thing over. I'm going to start stitching right where I stop, or I'm going to start stitching right where my last line of stitching ends. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, guys? My 2 lines of stitching should just meet on either side of the dart, is what I'm saying. There should not be a gap, and they don't really need to overlap, okay? So just have them meet exactly. I'm going to start stitching again. I'm going to back stitch. And then I'm just going to do the same thing that I did on that first side of the dart. I'm going to stitch to the point. Veering off very gradually, using my hand wheel if I need to. And then leaving those nice long tails and tying it off. And that's it. That's a fisheye dart. That's all there is to it. You see this a lot on like wiggle dresses, things that don't have a waistline seam but have a lot of contouring. So this really helps give you a great shape without a waistline seam. All right, so I'm going to trim all my threads close. And then we're going to press this. All these darts get pressed either to center front or center back, respectively. Okay, this is one of my front pieces, so I'm going to press it towards center front, where my interfacing is. On the back, the 2 darts get pressed towards each other, okay? So, but on the front, you're just going to press them individually toward your interfacing. So at the bottom, I just try to get it as flat as possible over the ham and just press the whole thing towards center front. And now you can focus on the upper end of the dart. And it's a little tricky when you get to the point. Just remember, like I always say, you want to get the point as flat as possible on your ham so that you don't get a pucker there. And there we go. We've sewn a lovely fisheye dart. So you're going to do that on the other side of center front, and then you have 2 fisheye darts on your top back. And then I'm going to go over to the table and I'm just going to explain the next steps with the shoulders and the side seams to you. Okay, let's talk about our shoulder and side seams. So here is my top back. You can see my darts are sewn here. And I'm going to take each top front and put it right sides together with the top back like this. And I'm going to sew my shoulder seams just across here like that. I'm going to pin here. I'm going to sew 5/8 of an inch along here and along there. And then what's a little unusual about the side seams is that you are only going to stitch between your circle marks. So you should have a circle mark at the underarm and then another one at the waist, because this remains open in the classic tea timer style. It's going to remain open below the waist on the sides here. So you're only going to sew between those two spots. Okay, so I'm going to pin each side seam, the shoulder seam. I'm going to sew all 4 of those seams and then press them open, and then we'll talk next steps. Okay, I'm starting with the shoulder seams. So I'm just, I got those edges to match, and now I am sewing at 5/8 of an inch with just a regular stitch length. And ending at my underarm circle. Okay, now we have a lot of pressing to do. So we're gonna press the shoulder seams open and the side seams open. Okay, so let's press this shoulder seam open. It's slightly curved, so the ham is great for this little seam. Let's do the other side. Okay, and now for these side seams. I'm going to get this nice and flat. I'm going to press the side seam open, like so. And now I'm going to take a little time to press below that seam. I'm going to press these seam allowances in 5/8 of an inch because they're eventually going to get top stitched. So nice to have those pressed in now. So don't be like me. Actually measure this. Use a ruler as you're doing this. A little seam gauge is great, or a clear ruler. So that's my opening below the waistline circle. Do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to press this side seam open. And then below the waistline circle, again, I'm just going to press in these seam allowances in preparation for top stitching them later. So this is so fun. You can see how it's starting to come together with that great open side. Now, while we're here with the iron, it's a great idea to also turn in your armhole openings and press them 5/8 of an inch. So I am going to grab my seam roll, is a great tool for this little roll. And you can put it just in the sleeve like this. So what you're going to be doing here is just, again, turning your seam allowances in 5/8 of an inch and pressing, okay? So I'm going to go all the way around the sleeve like that, pressing it in 5/8 of an inch, again, in preparation for top stitching this. So I'm going to work on pressing those seam allowances in now, and then the next thing we're going to do is talk about how to sew the collar. Let's work on your collar next. You should have 2 collars cut out in your top fabric, and you're going to want to interface one of them. So I've cut it out in that interfacing I showed you earlier and applied it with my iron. So that's fully fused to one, and then the other has nothing, okay? So next thing we're going to do is put these right sides together like this. And I'm going to pin around this outer edge here and the short sides, leaving it open along the side with the notches. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to pin all the way around like this. I'm going to keep going around here and end there. And then we're going to go over to the machine and I'm going to sew along that line. So again, just leaving it open along the neckline edge here, which is the notched edge. You can see my line of stitching here where I have sewn the upper edge and the short ends of my collar pieces together. And next thing we're going to do is grading, which means that we are going to trim the non-interfaced seam allowance so that it is about 1/8 of an inch or a scant 1/4 inch tall. So about like that. Should be aiming for between 1/8 and 1/4 if that helps. So I'm just trimming this one separately from the other seam allowance. And now I'm going to trim the other seam allowance so that it's just slightly wider than the first. And this prevents a ridge showing through from 2 seam allowances being cut the same length right on top of each other. So it's a clever little trick. It's very important when you have 2 seam allowances that are going to live right next to each other like this after you turn the collar right side out. All right, our next very important step is notching. So anytime we have an outer curve like this, we are going to want to make some little notches into it. And by that, I mean you're just taking the tip of your scissors, and they need to be nice and sharp for this, and cut out some little triangles around the curve. And this is going to help your curves look nice and crisp and smooth. About like that. And then we have a slight inner curve around here, so I'm going to do a few clips. Remember, you always clip inner curves and notch outer curves. So a clip is just a little snip like that. And now when I come around to the other side, again, I'm going to do some notches around the curve. So about like that for the notching. Now the next step is going to be to go over to the machine and understitch the non-interface side. So I'm going to need to open out the collar like this
and I'm going to stitch right along, close to the seam line right here, catching those seam allowances underneath in my stitching. So from one side to the other, if I can. Sometimes these curves are a little tricky. I'm going to stitch from the right side right along that seam line, and that's going to help the inner collar really roll in and give you a nice smooth edge on the right side.
Okay, time for understitching. So I'm going to open this out just like I just talked about, make sure that my seam allowances are underneath my needle, underneath where I'm stitching, and I'm just stitching less than 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line of the collar. And it's a little tricky around the curve right here. You have to really get in there and hold this open. Hold the two sides of the collar open like this. It looks like I'll be able to get around there, so that's great. Okay, so I'm going to go along this long upper edge of the collar here. And this can be a nice place to use an edge stitch foot or something like that. A similar foot to help you stitch evenly. So again, I'm coming around to this real tight curve here. And finishing up. All right, so next thing we're going to do is to press our collar flat. So let's get it placed on the ironing board here, turn right side out, and I'm working from the inside of the collar, and I'm using my fingertips to roll the understitching out towards the edge so I get a nice crisp edge, and then pressing the whole thing flat. Perfect. Okay, so you can see it's pressed nice and flat. It's going to be a beautiful little collar now. I'm going to trim these threads away, obviously. And the next thing you would normally do, and you might be tempted to do, is to baste these open edges closed so you have one unit. But you're actually going to need to leave them open because we're just going to stitch one side to the blouse. Okay, so leave this open and we're going to go back over to the table and I'll talk about how to pin it to your blouse.
Okay, so I have my collar laid out and my top. So what we're going to do is you're going to take your collar and you're going to pin the interfaced side to the blouse neckline. Okay, now there are a few markers to guide you here. The collar itself has notches on it which match up to the shoulder seams, and the blouse front should have a circle where the collar ends. Okay, so I want you to match your match points first, and then you're going to have to distribute some ease in between them. Okay, so what you're going to do is right sides together. Here, I'll start with one shoulder notch. I'm going to match the notch on the collar to the notch on the top. I'm sorry, the shoulder seam on the top. And then I'm going to take the end of the collar and match it to the circle on the blouse itself. And you see how there's a difference between the two? This is the kind of thing where I feel like people think that the pattern is wrong, but it's not. It's just a difference in the curves. So what we're going to need to do is clip into the seam allowance on the blouse itself and spread it to meet the shape of the collar. All right, but let's continue matching our match points first. So we have the notch on the collar, which matches the opposite shoulder seam right here. And then I have another circle on my blouse front, which is where the collar ends. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm really going to get in here in the collar and make some little snips up to the stay stitching. So anywhere that you need to, just make some snips like that. And then the two pieces should be able to match once you spread those clips open. Like so. Whoops, lost a pin. And I'm going to continue around the neckline like that, clipping into the collar, the blouse seam allowance so that the clips will spread. And I'm just going to make sure that I'm keeping this uninterfaced side of the collar open like so. So again, clipping on this side. And I'm going to clip along the back neckline edge. Careful, obviously, not to stitch or clip past your stay stitching. All right, so now that I've done those clips, these pieces fit together just fine. So this is like a concept of easing and two opposing curves that have to fit together. So we should be able to stitch this just fine now, though it is a little tricky because you have to get in between the collar layers to stitch the collar on, okay? So you're just gonna hold one side of the collar up like this, and then with your presser foot, get in between those layers and stitch this on. Now you don't have to worry too much about these edges, the finished ends of the collar, because we're eventually going to turn this facing around and stitch it in place. So it will be reinforced. So don't fret too much about that edge right there. If you can't get in there real close with your presser foot, you're going to just get as close as you can and stitch along the collar neckline edge.
Now we're ready to stitch between the two layers of the collar, stitching the interface side of the collar to the blouse itself around the neckline. Okay, so like I said, you really got to get in between these two layers here. I'm stitching at 5/8 of an inch. I'm using my regular stitch length, so like 2.5 to 3 is great. But again, not so important. You'll see when you start to do this, it's a little bit tricky because it's a tiny little space, but it doesn't matter if you don't get all the way to the very edge of the collar, okay? Because we are going to reinforce that in the next step. All right, so keeping your layers nice and flat and keeping those clips on the bottom spread open on the neckline edge, we're just going to stitch along the collar itself, stitching it to the blouse, all the way along this edge. And the way we're doing this now is nice because it eliminates the need for a separate back neckline facing. And you'll see what I mean when we get there, but I know a lot of people don't like facings in their garments around the neckline edge. So this eliminates the need for that. So we're going to get a nice clean finish once we turn in the seam allowances and hand stitch them. This is probably the trickiest part of this project. It's a pretty quick and easy project, but this one you may not have encountered. This step, you may not have encountered this before, so just take your time. Alright, so I'm all the way to the other side, and I'm going to backstitch. Okay, now I would definitely recommend that you check for any little pleats or puckers along the blouse edge, because it can be easy to get a little fold caught as you're stitching, but mine looks like it's okay. So you don't really need to press anything right now. Next thing we're going to do is go over to the table again, and I'm going to describe how to turn the facings out. So we're getting there. Look how cute this collar looks. I'm so excited about this. Okay, let's go back over to the table and we will chat.
So now you can see that the collar is sewn to the neckline, but we have one open edge. The non-interface side of the collar is open right here, okay? So next thing you're gonna do is you're going to flip the collar back down like you sewed it on, and we're gonna turn these cut-on facings like this so that they're right sides together. So you're flipping them out to the right side of the garment, and you're flipping them out along the notch right here. Okay, so you're flipping them like that, and then the collar is going to be sandwiched in between the two layers of the blouse. Same thing on the other side. Flipping the edge out, the interfaced edge of the cut-on facing out, sandwiching the collar between the layers like that. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go stitch just along right here. And the reason for that is, here, I'll show you. The reason for that, we're going to stitch along here, and then we're going to be able to turn this right side out and get a nice finished edge there. It's going to be so beautiful. Just wait. Okay, so we're going to turn that back out and pin again. And again, I'm just stitching in that 2-inch area, sandwiching the collar right there, right along there. Same thing on the other side. You can see that I've stitched along the facing now, so just for 2 inches right there. Now the first thing you're going to do is you're going to clip through all of your seam allowances right next to the facing edge. Clip up to the stitching like that, okay? Next thing you're going to do is trim across this corner diagonally to reduce bulk. And then you can also grade these seam allowances. So the interfaced one can be slightly shorter. The next one can be a little bit taller. Okay, so this will allow us to turn the facing right side out like this, and the collar to flip up the way it's supposed to be. And the next thing you're going to do is press the collar seam allowances up inside the collar, flip this seam allowance of the collar, the uninterfaced seam allowance, flip it in like this so you get a completely clean finish right there, pin it in place, and then we're going to slip stitch this along the edge. So I'm going to go to the iron and I'm going to press all of that in place, get it nice and pinned, and then I'll be ready to slip stitch the collar edge. You can see the clean finish now where I've turned in all the collar and neckline seam allowances so they're completely enclosed inside the collar edge here. And how nice it looks with that front facing. And so now I just have this edge right here that's loose, and you're going to need to slip stitch this in place. So I'm just going to go through the layers like this, using a slip stitch or whatever your preferred hand stitch is for this type of work. And I'm going to stitch first the neckline edge seam allowance and then tunnel through that collar fold. And this is going to give us a beautiful clean finish on the inside of the collar. So I'm going to go all the way around the neckline edge like this, that fold. And then we're ready to do some finishing on our top, on the hem. All right, so you can see that I have finished hand stitching my collar on the inside there. So I've got a nice clean finish and my little facings are looking very beautiful. And so next thing we're going to talk about is finishing. So first I want to say, remember how we turned in our armhole edges. The next thing you're going to do is hem them. So just like you did on the Harlow pajama. So again, if you want to reference that, you're going to top stitch around that opening and you can pivot around the underarm. Okay, so do that. And then the next thing you'll want to look at is your closures. So all of this is marked on the pattern, by the way, but let me just talk you through it. So there's an inch overlap, the two edges at center front. And there are going to be frog closures that go down from the neckline to the waistline opening. So where the sides open like this. So follow the markings on the pattern. And if you look at a frog closure, you'll notice that one side has a ball knot and the other side has a loop. So make sure that you have the balls on the same side when you place these. The first one goes up around here somewhere again. But again, reference your pattern. And you're just going to place them like this with the balls at the overlap. And you're going to hand stitch each side separately to the top itself. And again, if you need a little more help with this, please do check out the Harlow video because at the end I do talk about hand stitching frogs on. Okay, so those are your closures. And then the next thing we need to talk about is the hem of the blouse itself. So let me turn this, actually let me just pull it up here so you guys can see. How's that? Okay. So the unusual thing about this hem, obviously, is that it's going to be done in separate parts. I mean, you stitch it all together, but there are three sort of separate flaps here, right? So what I've done at the bottom is turned in the hem 5/8 of an inch all the way around. And then at the corners, I just kind of did this faux mitering thing where you can just kind of turn under the edge like that and get a sort of diagonal slant right here at the corner. Okay, so that's the back. And then on each front panel, you're going to do the same thing at the side seam corner. And then at the front opening, I think it looks best if you first turn up your hem and then press in the cut on facing and just turn it up a little bit at the edge here, okay? And so once you've pressed everything in place, you're going to machine stitch this all in one go. So you can start at the center front opening, stitch along the edge 1/2 inch, pivot here, stitch along the side seam to secure that seam allowance, pivot at the side seam opening, and so on, and then stitch along this side, pivot again, okay? So you're going to be going like that around the segments and top stitching both the hem and these slits on the side. And then your top is finished. Let's talk about the pants. So I've made these pants just like you would the Harlow. Like I said, the construction is exactly the same with the elastic waist and the crotch seam and the inseam and the outseam and all of that. All the steps are going to be the same. The only difference is the slits at the outseam. Okay, so there's a circle mark and you can see, hopefully, my disappearing ink mark is still there. And that's where you're supposed to stop stitching on the out seam. So you sew from the waist down to that circle mark and then stop. And now there are a lot of similarities between this and the hem we just did on the blouse, okay? Because what you're gonna do is turn in those seam allowances on the out seam. You're gonna turn up your hem allowance, 5/8 of an inch all the way around. And I did the same little like faux mitering thing that I did there. I don't know if that's actually a term, but I've decided it is. Faux mitering, where you just turn in that edge right there. And then I top stitch. So I started stitching at the inseam, stitched around, pivoted at that corner, did another pivot here, another pivot there, and then finished by overlapping my stitching at the inseam. Okay, and that's it. Your pants are done, your blouse is done. Final thing you can do for just a fun little touch is do some frogs at the outseam slit as well. Looks super cute. So just a thought, consider it. All right, there we go. Beautiful looking pants.
Okay, I have Hattie here to tell you that she's so proud of you for sewing your tea timers. And you can see how beautifully it came together. And it's a fairly simple project, and I feel like it's easy to do in a day. So it's a great, quick summer sewing project. So I'm going to finish up with my hand stitching and sewing my frogs on and my hems and all that. And I'm so excited that I'm going to have Melisha to do a little photo shoot. So you'll get to see Melisha in photos, which I know you always love. So don't forget to share photos with us. You can hashtag your project Charm Tea Timer. Okay, so share it on social media. We want to see your projects. And I hope you really love this. It's really fun to sew and to play in and to lounge in. And it's just a great summer project. So we will see you next time. Goodbye. Say it with me, Hattie. Goodbye.